This is one of the best builds on Sorcerer. This is my only character since the game came out and I've been playing a lot, so I'm going to show you the build I've been using for this character. The reason why this build is so good is that it shreds through every content in the game and you don't need any specific legendaries to make this build work. Though there are a few aspects that will help make this build an absolute beast, so let's get right into it. One of the most crucial things about this build is that this build is focused on barrier. Because the build is focused on barriers, by and large, this build uses 4 cooldown skills. We're also going to be pumping all of our damage into one skill, which is Ice Shards, and all of the skills that we take are going to help us do this. The first skill we take is Firebolt. We're spicking all the way into Glinting Firebolt for extra mana regen. At lower levels, mana regen is going to be very important to upkeep our damage. But the second reason why we take it is that against bosses, this skill has really good stagger. Against mobs, this is a mana regeneration skill and only does slightly less damage than Arclash. Later in the game, when you have really good cooldown and mana regen, you can drop this skill for another skill or an ultimate, but for now, we're going to keep Firebolt. Second, we take our bread and butter, which is Ice Shards. Ice Shards, the whole reason this build exists. It's our machine gun. Ice Shards release 5 waves of 5 Ice Shards, which does bonus damage against frozen enemies. With this build, everything will be frozen, so you will always be doing 25% more damage. We're taking Enhanced Ice Shards, so it can ricochet to other targets, and we're taking Greater Ice Shards. Whilst you have a barrier active, Cast of Ice Shards treat enemies as if they were frozen. With this one perk, this changes our entire build, and it makes our build insane. You're going to have a barrier up most of the time, meaning that Ice Shards will always be dealing 25% more damage. Next, we take 3 defensive skills. Teleport with the enhanced cooldown reduction, and the Shimmering perk for the extra damage reduction. This is basically a no-brainer in every Sorcerer build. Ice Barrier, this is a barrier that naturally synergizes with our build, so we're going to be taking the enhanced Ice Barrier for extra mana regeneration for 6 seconds. Finally, we have Frost Nova. With the mystical perk, this makes it one of the only sources of vulnerable on Sorcerer, so we have to take this to maximize our damage. Frost Nova is one of the most important skills in this build. If you can spare more skill ranks into this skill, or get armor that increases this rank, or has cooldown reduction, do it. Reducing cooldowns is one of the most important things to make this build work effectively in the higher tiers of the game. Frost Nova freezes everything around you and makes everything vulnerable, making you pump out way more damage. You can opt to take Flame Shield as your 4th defensive skill, but I find the cooldown is a bit too long, and since we're always going to have a barrier, you won't need Flame Shield. Ice Blades is one of the only other ways of applying vulnerable targets and has a relatively short cooldown compared to Flame Shield, so we take Ice Blades. Now with enchantments. Early in the game, at level 15, you'll want to spec into Fireball. This is by far one of the best enchantments early in the game, so you'll want to take Fireball for insane area effect damage. Later in the game, you'll be dropping Fireball and you'll be picking up Firebolt instead. Firebolt makes it so that your skills deal burning. The second enchantment that you'll pick up is Ice Shards. Ice Shards automatically conjure and fly towards frozen enemies. Since you'll have a barrier all the time, you'll always have Ice Shards flying around everywhere frozen targets. Now let's talk about one of the most important passives for the Sorcerer, Protection. Using a cooldown grants 30% of your maximum life as a barrier for 2 seconds. While you have a barrier active, Cast of Ice Shards treat enemies as if they were frozen. Ice Shards deal 25% extra damage to frozen enemies, and Ice Shards will always ricochet off frozen targets. Ice Shards will also automatically conjure and fly towards frozen enemies. This means that when you use one of your 4 cooldown skills and use Ice Shards will fly everywhere across the screen and blast everything. Another passive that pairs naturally with Protection is Icy Veil. Icy Veil makes it so that your barriers have an increased 15% duration. This also means that your skill Ice Armor, which normally lasts 6 seconds, will now last 7 seconds. The Elemental Attunement passive will make it so that Lucky Hit critical strikes have up to 15% chance to reset one of your defensive cooldowns, and this can only happen every 10 seconds. This means that you'll also be able to have a defensive skill up more often so that you can apply more barriers and deal more damage with Ice Shards. Now with the enchantment effect that applies burning, there are 2 passives that synergize with this. The first we have is Devouring Blaze. You deal 30% increased critical strike damage against burning enemies. And the other is Fiery Surge. Killing a burning enemy increases your mana regen by 30% for 3 seconds. This will make it so that we're dealing more damage and also having increased mana regen that we are starving in the early to mid stages of the game. Finally, with our capstone passive, we're taking Avalanche. Lucky hit, your frost skills have up to 10% chance to make your next cast of ice shards consume no mana and deal 40% increased damage. Chances doubled against vulnerable enemies. This will allow us to save more mana so we can spam ice shards and deal more damage as well. Now let's talk about some legendary aspects that will really help out this build. So we have aspect of piercing cold, which will make your ice shards pierce. This means that your ice shards have a higher chance of ricocheting as they'll hit multiple targets, and this just makes your ice shards so much stronger as a skill. You will feel the difference with this legendary aspect. The other is aspect of control, which means that we'll deal more damage to frozen enemy. And since we're going to be freezing things all the time with Frost Nova, this damage will always be in effect. I'll leave a link to this build in a build planner in the description down below. Note that most of the legendaries I've put in the build are legendaries that you can reliably get from aspect dungeons, not legendaries that you need to find out in the open world. But there are more legendaries, such as Conceited Aspect, that combos with barriers. So if you get those, that will really make this build take off. The other thing to note is I've put a rough Paragon board pathway in the build planner, but it's not optimized. So just bear that in mind when you're planning out your Paragon board. The last thing to go through is just the basic skill rotation. It's very simple, you cycle your cooldown skills. I usually teleport into a mob or a boss and use Frost Nova. This will apply freeze and vulnerable, for which I can benefit all of the damage passives. Then I use ice shards and just blast everything down. That's it for this build guide. If you found this video helpful, please drop me a like down below if you want to see my channel grow. And as always, have an awesome day and bye for now.